welcome back to the History of Christianity. Last time we broke into the medieval times and we looked at the rise of the papacy and what was taking place there with the church. And today we're going to look at the Eastern Church. We can't forget that as we keep focusing on the West, and that is definitely going to be our focus, but we cannot forget that there's an Eastern side to the church. And today we're going to look at some doctrinal issues that came up in the Eastern side of the church and how the church came about to solve those doctrinal issues. So stay tuned for the PowerPoint. Okay, class, we're going to move into the PowerPoint on Eastern Christianity. Okay, just some introductory material here. Remember, the church was still one. It was still one church, and we can't forget that there was an Eastern side of the church. And this is going to actually split in 1054. So the church is going to continue as one church all the way up till then, and which is well into the Middle Ages. But in the early Middle Ages, it's still one church. There's just an Eastern portion and a Western portion. By the early Middle Ages, the two sides had been drifting apart. The West was Latin, the East was Greek. There were social differences, there were political differences. The West, with the fall of the Roman Empire, the power vacuum was filled with the church and with the Pope, who controlled civil matters and political affairs and ecclesiastical affairs. The Pope really was in charge there. In the East, the empire continued with what we would call emperors, even though we don't know them very well. They're not prominent emperors. They're just leaders over there. And they would continue well into the Central Middle Ages. But they were continually invaded, and the church would continuously look towards the civil authorities for help to solve theological issues. That's in the East. And we're going to look at some theological issues here, mainly revolving around Christ, so what we would call Christological issues. And we're going to look at four of these issues. Christological issue number one. There's the Council of Nicaea in 325 that confirmed the Trinity and Jesus Christ's divinity. So that's all settled. It was actually even reconfirmed at the Council of Constantinople in 381. The issue now was how Jesus' divinity and humanity could come together. How these two, what we would say Jesus is fully human and Jesus is fully God, how could these come together? And there were some different thoughts on that. Now, a note must be said, in the West, this was not so much of an issue. Over there on the western portion of the church with the Pope and in Europe, because they followed Tertullian's two natures in one. There's the divine nature and the human nature in one person, Jesus Christ. Now, there were two schools of thought on how this union came together. First, there's the Alexandrian thought. You see there on the screen, Jesus is divine and human. Jesus had a human soul, but a divine intellect. Jesus came to speak for the Father, and he just needed a body. So just those 3 points there, you can kind of start seeing that it's developing into a doctrine that the West, or even Orthodox Christianity, would not even agree with. Because what happened is, in the Alexandrian school, Jesus' humanity was diminished. There was this big focus on Jesus being God, and that's obviously important. But we also need to understand that Jesus is also 100% human. And in this thought, the Alexandrian thought, they basically said the divine part we're okay with, but the human part, there just need to be a physical body provided. There you go. And so it really diminished Jesus' humanity. The second portion of this thought was the Antiochene thought, where they said Jesus is divine and human, just like the Alexandrian. They rejected the human soul and divine intellect union of the Alexandrian thought. They basically said, we don't agree with this preeminence of the divinity portion and kind of the putting down the human portion. They said if this were so, basically Jesus would not really truly be a human. So Jesus' humanity must not just be just another body. There was something special here. So they said Jesus is fully God and fully human to save mankind. That's the Antiochene thought. So what happened? At the Council of Constantinople 381, they rejected the Alexandrian school of theology. The Alexandrian was rejected, and so we think of what we would believe in Orthodoxy. Jesus is 100% God and 100% man, and it's in one person, Jesus Christ, the second person of the triune Godhead. So that's Christological issue number one. You see here on the right-hand side of the screen, 883 AD, an illumination in the homilies of St. Gregor of Nazianzus, which is the Council of Constantinople, where they're rejecting this Alexandrian school of theology. Okay, Christological issue number two. Nestorius, who was from the school of Antioch, declared that Mary should not be called Theotokos, which means bearer of God, but Christotokos, which means bearer of Christ. So Nestorius, he had a problem with what Mary was being called. He didn't believe she should be called bearer of God. Now, the interesting thing is that this focus was not on Mary, which we might think of with the Catholic Church, everything's about Mary. This focus was not on Mary, but it was on Jesus. Because if Mary was not called the bearer of God, but the bearer of Christ, it actually diminishes Christ's deity. They're basically saying that Nestorius was basically saying that Christ is not God, if you delineate it this way. So Nestorius said in Christ there are two natures, divine and human, and two persons, divine and human. So now we're having another issue. The human side, the human nature and the human person, that was born of Mary. The divine side, the divine nature and the divine person, that was not born of Mary. So now we see, instead of two natures in one person, we see two natures in two persons. So immediately there's criticism for trying to divide Jesus and forcing an agreement of these natures instead of a union. So what happened? Cyril, who was from the school of Alexandria, led the fight against Nestorius. Now he sought help from the West, who agreed a two natures in two persons of Christ, that's heresy. So the West is against Nestorius. Cyril seeks the help of the West. Remember, this is the Eastern Church we're talking about. There's an Ecumenical Council of Ephesus of 331 called Nestorius, and they really hammered him. They declared him a heretic without even allowing a defense. Now, a small delegation arrived late in support of Nestorius, and they actually held a rival council and declared Cyril a heretic and tried to reinstate Nestorius. So Emperor Theodosius II, he needs to step in. He voids both councils. He holds a third council in 433. Now in this meeting, again, Nestorius is declared a heretic, but the emperor forced both sides to a formula of a union. And Nestorius ends up being exiled to Petra. So we get back to the Orthodox belief of this union of the two natures of Christ in one person. All right, the next Christological issue, number 3, is Dioscorus, who was Cyril's successor in Alexandria, who we just talked about, his successor, said Jesus was one substance with the Father, but was not one substance with man. So again, now we're going to have issues coming up. Flavian of Constantinople, who was of the school of Antioch, condemned Dioscorus and purposefully escalated and pushed the issue so it spread around the empire. Emperor Theodosius II steps in again and holds the Council of Ephesus of 449. However, Dioscorus positioned himself as the authority. His supporters violently attacked and beat Flavian, and he died a few days later. So obviously we're seeing a serious issue going on theologically. They beat a guy to death who is the one that said this about Christ being one substance with the Father, but was not one substance with man. And the council condemned the Christ with two natures in one. Okay, that's very important to understand. That theology had already been set. Jesus Christ, two natures, divine and human, in one. Well, this council condemns that. Well, Pope Leo in Rome was furious, and he demanded a new council. He was basically saying that this council has declared a new heresy, and so he demands a new council. But suddenly Theodosius II, he falls off his horse and breaks his neck. His sister, Pulcheria, took over and agreed with the Antiochene position. So she agrees with the Pope in Rome and calls the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Now this is an interesting council because it condemns the previous position, the position that condemned the Christ with two natures. It condemns that. It reinstates that Christ has two natures, a divine and a human nature, in one person. So we're back to the way it was. And that became the established definition of faith in regards to Christ for the church. So that settles the issue. And finally, Christological issue number 4. Early on, images of Jesus, communion, different biblical images, they were used to decorate the catacombs of the early dead Christians. But over time, and after Christianity became the religion of the empire, leaders in the East began to reject the use of images that they feared would bring idolatry. This led to a division in the Eastern Church. Should they use images or should they not use images? And it developed into two different groups. The Iconoclasts believed that images should not be used and these images should be destroyed. They should be taken out of the churches. There's no statues, no pictures, no images of anything. A lot of times they would be pictures that were made with little tiles called mosaics. They completely destroy these things, get them out of the church. The other side was the iconodules. These people, they would actually go and use these images in worship and worship the images. And their definition, or I should say defense of this, was that if God incarnate was visible, meaning Jesus Christ, then a visible image is okay to use in your worship. And they also said that God himself was the first image creator when he created man in his own image. So that was the defense the iconodules gave. And this would rage back and forth for a while. And finally, in the 7th Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 787 AD, so now we moved into the 8th century in the eastern portion of the church, they came to this belief that there was a higher worship and a lesser worship. The higher worship was when one went in and gave worship to God. They went in, they were worshiping Almighty God, so that's their higher worship. But they also believed that if they went in and they worshiped images, that was okay also, but that was considered a lesser worship. Okay, so I guess it's kind of like a lesser idea of idolatry, but they believe this to be of lesser worship. Finally, by 842 AD, in the entire empire, images were being used in churches. There were statues being put up in the West, but definitely images throughout the empire and the church were being used in worship. Okay, so that's our look at Eastern Christianity. Again, it's the eastern portion of the church and a focus on the controversies and some of the Christological issues that came up in Eastern Christianity. I'll see you in a second. Okay, class, that's it for that PowerPoint of the Eastern portion of the church. And next time we are going to look at the rise of Charlemagne and the Carolingian Empire. And then we're going to begin to look at the decay of the church and how it really starts going downhill with corruption, with numerous issues within the church, with multiple popes at one time. So the church really gets into some trouble, and we'll be looking at that next time. Have a great day.